if you were. So in our time together, gathering those emergency leaders, the leadership, or some at that time did have someone appointed to look after the community, not only the community infrastructure and businesses and those family members connected to community. So that is I think the history around the work that the communities and entrepreneurs have done within Stalo. And so when the atmospheric river took place, the landslides, the stranded motorists, we think of the impacts to businesses and communities, especially within the eastern part of the valley of S'ólh Téméxw. And so we, in our first workshop, we had our neighboring nations share. We had a presentation from Teresa's just calling me, the impact to a well-known business, the Cry Out Lodge, and then also the Native gallery that was in the lodge when it caught fire. So we had the presentation there in our past workshop. And then also Lisa Benini, maybe some of you have met her. She's a leader in business continuity and emergency planning in BC. And she shared a 15-step process, which is the steps that we'll be taking in supporting the communities that we have here, and not businesses and community. And so we're really starting that journey of supporting our businesses. And if you have a business continuity plan or you don't, that's the support that we'll be providing. Not only that, but keeping you up to date and connected. And I'll talk a little bit more about if you're in community or community, what would take place and who supports you. So with that, did you want to give a bit of history, Rocio? And Teresa keeps contacting me. It doesn't look like she can call in, so I'm just gonna connect with her and
no
let her
problem.
know. No worries if she's struggling, and then we'll get started with the other presentations. Thanks.
Absolutely not, no problem. So what we did was we know that we were all impacted by the flooding. And for us as Stalo Community Futures, certainly it's not, we're not the go-to emergency group, but we understand about providing the resources and how can we best support you in moving forward in advance on what tools you need, just a checklist. Do you need a thumb drive? Gathering statistics, getting information that will ultimately be put into a report that will be sent to our funders from the Ministry of Jobs, Economic Recovery and Innovation. They're the ones that have provided the funding for us to be able to hold the position, get Diane to join us to lead this for us, so that ultimately we can let them know what we've done to best prepare by bringing in people like Richard. I'm really looking forward to your presentation and your feedback. Teresa, I know she's struggling, poor thing, and also Michael Suedfeld from Sq'ewá. So ultimately, at the end of the day, you'll be hearing more and more from Diane Garner. She'll be doing more one-on-ones in the coming months. We have a couple of years under this program to roll this out. So there'll be more visits. You'll see more workshops. We may do some community information sessions. We may go out into the communities and hold these kind of sessions and workshops on different topics. Aside from atmospheric, the floodings and other disasters that we've learned from the interior, from our fellow community futures offices who have been impacted with so many other things, that we can share that knowledge with you all to assist you and have you be as best prepared as you can.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Teresa.
It doesn't seem it's not letting her join in. So why don't we get started with Richard? Would you like to get started with your presentation and your introduction? And before we start, do we want to go around the room and have everyone just share, introduce themselves first, and how they're connected to businesses and something like they hope to learn today? So I would like to do that. Awesome. So we'll start with Marianne. Oh, you're on mute, Marianne. Thank you.
Unmute. Hello, sorry about that. I am with AJ Towing in Chilliwack. I'm kind of interested in hearing what we should have done during the flood. But so thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you. Laurie Thomas.
I'm Laurie Thomas. I'm from Mission. I'm starting looking into doing a photography business. So I'm just trying to get all the information and just anything I can learn, really. So thank you for having me.
So, Cook STEM, thank you. Pete.
Hi all. My name's Pete Goodsward, Paramount Digital Security. We're an IT service provider. Laurie, I used to run a photography studio, so if you want to reach out, I'm quite happy to help you, no cost. I've learned a lot of lessons over the years about photography. I've done a lot of things in that area, so feel free. Anyway, that's aside from that. So I've done a bit of work with emergency planning. I used to, I still consult for the Lillooet Tribal Council. Daryl Adrian's the emergency management coordinator over there, and did a little bit with a company called HEPR, the Holistic Emergency Planning and something recovery, right? Over there. And of course, as an IT service provider, a lot of what we do is our client. I mean, cybersecurity is basically emergency planning. So of course, those things go hand in hand, right? As well, I'm an off-road recovery instructor, and that's emergency planning, first aid, that type of thing. And as well, I'm an amateur radio operator, which is of course for civil emergencies. So a lot of these things all roll together. And anyway, that's me personally. Swampy Cree from of course back east. So anyway, enough time for me. Move on. Thanks.
A valuable resource. We're going to connect, especially about the Ham Radio Club, and important. And he's in Abbotsford. Perfect. Cheyenne.
Good day, everyone. My name is Cheyenne Ned. I am the executive assistant to Richard Hall, which is our director of the Governance and Natural Resource Department here in Sumas First Nation. I am looking forward today just to listening in and kind of looking in at different aspects of the group here, and very excited. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. And we have Demery, D-E-M-E-R-Y. Demery? Oh no.
It's Dale.
Dale. Thank
Dale.
you.
You're welcome. Sorry. It's okay. You would know that from the.
I know. Dale's maybe. There you are.
I'm just listening in and learning. I love to learn, and the experiences that each one of you have shared with me in the past is incredible. Keep it up. Thank you very much. Got an accounting background. But, that's all. I just wanted to share. Bye.
Thank you. Ernie.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ernie Victor. I work for GM Enterprises as a special projects lead. I got two projects we have I'm working with PricewaterhouseCooper and AE Consulting on stabilizing our boat launch and protecting one of our buildings from that same last year's November washout kind of. So we have some experience there, and I'm here kind of to learn from other First Nations experiences on what they went through dealing with these folks, and how that money kind of came out, and if it came out the right way. Is there something we can do, next time if there is, hopefully not a next time, but how that response to emergency needs on First Nation lands. So just kind of listening in to see if I can learn something from that. The second project, we were right in the middle of buying a golf course. We had a debris flow come out from the mountain. It's a big geotech issue, and it was definitely the debris flow went right across the golf course and across the road. So that's kind of our big issue with that, is the due diligence around this big washout that happened last November again on the mountainside and right on the golf course. So that's, it's affecting us in our purchase. It's affecting our role with the gondola developments and such. So we're just doing our due diligence with that. And we haven't had much support on this, because it's off reserve land for one. I think that might be it, but we're First Nations buying our core traditional territory back, right? So it's that's another kind of area that I want to explore and find support for. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ernie. And Gertrude.
My name is Richard.
Oh, we can't hear you. Yeah, you're still muted. If you want to put,
she's
oh,
got
there
a
we go.
message in the chat saying
Yeah,
that
maybe
she
just put
missed
it in the chat.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So I think we've introduced everyone. So I'm just gonna all right. Great. So can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Oh, awesome. Let's get this out of the way. I tell you, I haven't had very much luck with tech stuff this morning. So again, thank you for being here, and just wanted to acknowledge the support from Benini Consulting, but disaster proofing your business. So I wanted to acknowledge, we'll look to have Teresa next time. And one of the things today, Rosio got to do our welcome, but we'll have Teresa share. She's a business owner out in Hope, and she was wanting to share how she was impacted. Sorry, I have my little dog. She was gonna share about how her, you might all know her Native Art Gallery in Hope, on how she was impacted by the atmospheric river. And also we have Richard here, and then also Michael Suedfeld. And so these here, just to show the example, these were taken by me. I actually happened to be there when we had when the Quiet Lodge fire took place. We were there for a family gathering, and those are the pictures from there. So what I'm excited about and so grateful that we're starting to talk about the stepping stones. I really see within the businesses and the work that the community is doing, the stepping stones in the following, areas of prevention, mitigation, business continuity planning, preparedness, response, and recovery, as we're all connected in community and businesses, and starting to know, the impacts that we have. We are are more concerned. In the last 2 years, the top picture is the slide that took place, which was on highway number 7. Of course, we're here to talk about today the flooding of Sumas Lake. The picture is also out at Sq'ewá. That's the landing site for where they have our canoe pulling and the mitigation work that Sq'ewá Village and Sq'ewá need to do every year to prepare for freshet. And of course, our most recent and really the biggest wildfire that we've had, the Flood Falls Trail wildfire, looking and that impacting Sq'ewá directly, but also the impacts of the smoke and the ashes, going across the river and impacting Sq'ewá. So one of the things that many communities and the work that we're doing is there is the reports acknowledging the Abbott Chapman report by Chief Maureen Chapman addressing the new normal, and then our Indigenous reports that we have there, trial by fire, and the fire wakens us by the Chilcotin government based in the 2017-2018 fires. So one of the things and what we're working on, what could go wrong, if something went wrong, how does it affect your business? What are some critical operations that for your business to resume if it's impacted by one of these events? And are you aware of the emergency plans where you are out of community or in community, and who would you contact? So are we prepared for this? So part of the work we're doing, who can you ask? Who are the current, do you have the current knowledge of resources, current business owner who's maybe been impacted or has a plan, and what do we think the next steps are? So with that, I'm gonna pull up your presentation, Richard. So can everyone see that okay? Can everyone see that okay?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, thank you. My sound isn't connected to my mic because of my audio problems today. So if you see me taking this off and on, it's because I can talk, but my ears are plugged. All right.
Perfect. I'm ready to go whenever you want.
Perfect. Thank you.
So good morning, everybody. My name is Richard Hall. Thank you for the opportunity and the honor to be able to share a little bit of what happened in the fall of 2021, and in particular, the implications to the Sumas First Nation, both in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. By way of background, so I've had the privilege of been with Sumas since the summer of 2020. I have an undergraduate degree in geography. I have a Master of Science, and then I'm a lawyer by profession. And one of the advantages was of my participation since the flood was my undergraduate training in geography, because I was exposed to geomorphology and meteorology courses. So I had a bit of a leg up in terms of understanding what was going on. But to be fair, I had never heard the term atmospheric river when I was doing my university training. So I think it was probably, other than the select meteorologists that you see on the TV, it was a new term to most of us in the province. And as we know now, our neighbors to the south in California are experiencing extreme weather events in terms of that atmospheric river. And it's exposed the weaknesses that we have in BC with respect to not only our ability to address and handle it, but also how to prepare going forward. And so some of my PowerPoint presentations will be related to the current initiatives that I'm involved with on behalf of the nation in relation to both the Washington state government and the BC government, and the support that hopefully will be brought to the table by the federal government. So it was in 2017 that the Sumas First Nation issued their declaration of where they were as a First Nation within BC. It's unceded territory. None of Chief and Council and none of the ancestors have actually entered into any legal relationship with both the federal and provincial governments. So in the Abbotsford River event in the fall of 2020, it was obviously something that was not expected. If most of you don't know, the water really emanated in particular from the overtopping and overflowing of the Nooksack River in the US. So when it gets to a certain level in the US, instead of flowing south west into Bellingham Bay, the water actually comes across Zero Avenue and then comes into the city of Abbotsford and the traditional territory of Sumas First Nation. My responsibility as the Director of Governance and Natural Resources is for all of the ancestral and traditional territory of Sumas. So that includes communications, it includes legal files. It also includes all levels of government. So the US, federal, provincial, and municipal governments, regional governments, other First Nations, our relationship with the Collaborative Stewardship Forum and the STSA, and then as well, individual stakeholders that participate in economic activities that are on our traditional land. So I don't have a focus at all with respect to the general manager with the what is typically referred to as on reserve issues. So when that event occurred and the eventual flowing of the water north into BC, it eventually resulted in, because it was such a significant volume of water, a breaching of the dike. And you'll be surprised to learn that the actual repair of the breach of the dike only took place earlier this week. And that was as a result of going out on a global basis to figure out what the best possible technology would be in order to repair the dike, just to get it to the pre-flood considerations and conditions. Part of my staff, my natural resources officer and our environmental technician, were out there earlier this week in fish salvage, and I'll be happy to report that we actually were able to rescue sturgeon and salmon that were on the wrong side of the dike. But my staff were completely covered in mud, I think up to their chests, in terms of operating in those conditions. And we had done that actually during the actual flood event when the waters had receded. So after the 3 weeks, my staff were out in the fields of the Sumas Prairie rescuing salmon and sturgeon that had been basically abandoned when the water receded, and we were able to then put them back into existing water courses. And so that was a significant benefit from our perspective to be able to rescue species that are particularly respected by the Sumas First Nation peoples. So during the actual flood event, at literally 7 to 8 o'clock in the morning, I would talk with my communications officer and Brian Jones, our general manager, and we would decide what kind of information we needed to get out to the community in order to deal with health and infrastructure risks. And then at the same time, we then participated in calls with the government at 9 o'clock in the morning with EMBC. Later the same day, Brian and myself would be involved in a 1 o'clock call every single day with City of Abbotsford, in particular Rob Isaac, he's the head engineer, and at times also the fire chief, to get a snapshot as to what was going on and what we then had to communicate to the community in order to make sure that all of the community members at Sumas were safe, and to provide daily updates apart from what was on the news every day. And then every Thursday of each week, I participated on a special call that the province had under EMBC to provide us with supply chain issues on a go-forward basis. This continued for approximately 3 weeks. I did that Monday to Friday. And then at the end of the day, Brian and I would touch base around 4 o'clock just to make sure that there was no other issues that had to be communicated to the community members. And Brian actually took it on for the additional 2 days over the weekend. And so maybe if we can just go back a little bit to the previous slide just for a second, please. Thank you. No, that's fine. Let's just jump then. I thought there was a previous one. Could we go to the very early one? Thank you. So that third bullet there, the red one, is in terms of a return of our ancestral lake. So if many of you don't know, Lake Sumas was there up until 1920, and it was in 1920 that the province decided that they were going to drain the lake in order to provide agricultural land to the settler community. It took approximately 4 years for that draining of the lake to occur. And the reason I want to kind of highlight this now is I'm going to touch on it towards the end in terms of, from a holistic perspective, what the technical teams and the policy teams are looking at with respect to water management in the future when the next flood event occurs, because it's not an if, it's really when it's going to happen. And that's in part because of climate change. It's also in part of infrastructure aging. And so one of the reasons that this wouldn't have been an issue in 1920, for example, is that lake was able to provide the ability for nature to withstand significant increases in water emanating from flood events. It was also a significant impact to the nation generally, because in the past it's been referred to as literally the grocery store of the Sumas peoples. Because of the lake in the summertime, the Sumas people would go onto the lake and they would have housing that was on stilts in order to get away from the mosquitoes. And throughout the year provided both aquatic and terrestrial food and medicinal resources. So it was the equivalent, I would suggest, from myself as a Caucasian, that there was a significant loss of an ancestral cultural icon. So it would be the equivalent from my perspective of, Buckingham Palace disappearing or Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. It was that significant, that much of a negative impact to the Sumas peoples. And so Councillor Ned, who used to be at Sumas First Nation Chief and Council for the last 25 years, decided not to run, but he was involved during this flood event. And he very correctly pointed out to me that this was an opportunity that was going to present to ourselves and to the province and to everybody that lives in the area to perhaps do things a bit differently and to look at things from a different perspective in order to prepare ourselves for the future. Then I'll talk a little bit about the impacts to the nation. I'll then go into a little bit of what's going on now in terms of what I'm classifying as the medium term. And that has, interestingly, only this week, I've tried to pin the government down to force them into thinking in a 10-year cycle with respect to temporary infrastructure remediation measures that they're taking on 7 different water courses, and in particular the Sumas River. We'll then talk a little bit about the watersheds strategy that the nation has developed. Up until the discussions with the province of British Columbia, there was a significant appetite to focus ourselves in on just the Sumas River and Vetter Canal watersheds, as opposed to looking at the Chilliwack watershed and as well the Nooksack watershed, because water goes where it wants to go at the end of the day, and that's not a surprise to anybody on this call. And so we really have to be much more clever as to how we try and manage as much as Mother Nature as we can within the confines of the society that is built around it. And then I'll obviously be more than happy to entertain kind of a question and answer. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Wanted to provide you with a little bit of a background and certainly how I conduct myself as an advocate and a representative of the nation in terms of what is core to the vision. So the caring for the land and all living things, giving back, speaking for our people, and speaking for the land, fish, and all living things with the recognition that we are one. And that's a very familiar phrase that I think a lot of you will know of Let's Emote. And I can skip over the rest of that. You're welcome to have copies of this slide going forward. And it's perhaps a bit of a different take than I think the people on the call here were perhaps anticipating, but this is what I thought would be helpful overall. So if I missed the mark, I apologize, but perhaps it would provide a bit of an education for everybody in terms of literally what happened, what has happened in the time to date, and then what is going to happen going forward, because it's a very significant project that I'll be able to provide some information to you on in terms of what would potentially be visited on the landscape with a lens from 2 perspectives. I'm university trained and I've dealt with engineers over my 3-decade career, both as an executive and a lawyer. So I appreciate what they bring to the table, but I want to counterbalance that with the vision of Indigenous peoples. And in particular, I speak on behalf of Sumas First Nation, that it has to be viewed with a cultural, environmental, spiritual, and social lens. So that holistic approach that I think has been significantly missing in Western culture. And so I think thankfully that it's now arrived and it's starting to fulfill its rightful place as we move forward as a society generally. And so I would encourage each of you to kind of look at what transpired here as an opportunity to maybe look at things differently in your daily lives, but also in terms of what you do professionally and personally with that First Nations lens. Thank you. Next slide. And if I'm going too fast, please let me know. And if you do have questions while I'm talking, don't be shy. I'm happy to entertain them at the end because I know this inside out. But equally, I'm happy if there's a question that you really want to ask that you don't want to miss. So as I said a little bit earlier, we've really advocated since day one a watersheds collaborative approach. Not surprisingly, and again, this isn't a criticism, this is a comment. I mean, I've worked for the Alberta government, the BC government, and the federal government, and I've worked overseas. And so typically government, certainly Western government, is operated on the basis of silos. And so when you're in a ministry, you're wanting to look at what the expertise is that ministry can bring to the table. So initially, this flood issue was addressed from an EMBC perspective. As many of you may know, that's now morphed into a full ministry under the new Premier's leadership. And so that's now emergency management and climate reconciliation. So many of the individuals that worked in EMBC have transitioned over into this new ministry. And as well, I worked and have worked very closely with my team and Sumas leadership at the chief and council level, and in particular, ex-councillor Murray Ned and the new councillor Troy Ganzeveld, to deal with the Ministry of Forests in particular, because they were given the mandate to try and figure out how the province was going to address things going forward. So Alan Johnsrud, Laura LaPlante, Lee Johnson, and a new assistant deputy minister that was in the Ministry of Agriculture and is now with EMRC by the name of Jennifer McGuire, is now at the table at a number of different levels. So the federal government kind of took a back seat to this from our experience. And in particular, we were concerned about the lack of attention that was being brought to bear with respect to the fish. So the aquatic piece of the puzzle here, and the implications with respect to salmonoid in particular species, so and all 5 of them. And then to a lesser degree, other fish species. And then there's a provincial overlap with respect to steelhead in particular and sturgeon as well. Clearly, we were heavily involved with the city of Abbotsford, to a much lesser degree, the city of Chilliwack, much more involvement recently with respect to the sediment removal task force to address the Chilliwack River watershed and the 400,000 cubic meters that came down upstream of the Chilliwack river system and then found its way into the Vetter Canal. And so I'll get into a little bit more discussion later on that. And then First Nations, so in particular, Lecamal First Nation, and up until 1953, Lecamal and Sumas First Nation were one and the same before the federal government artificially divorced the 2 different bands into 2 separate First Nations. So we work quite closely with Lecamal, and the other First Nation we work very closely with is Sq'ewá First Nation. There is a society that was set up in 2010 called the LMS Society, which stands for Lecamal, Sq'ewá, and Sumas First Nation. And that was the first society in Canada that I'm aware of that was set up to lead to the eventual handover of the 160 acres in total. I think it was 60 hectares of the Heritage Park at the City of Mission. So we've had a very, very positive relationships in over 12 years now, but that handover didn't take place until the summer of 2021. And I sit on the technical committee with that society, provide guidance and recommendations and leadership to the board of directors, which is comprised of both Chief Ellis's and Chief Dalton Silver from the nation that I work with. So some very interesting partnerships grew out of that. And if I go back to that comment earlier that Councillor Ned had made, is that there was a significant opportunity here to build much more positive relationships going forward on a number of fronts. And so it's opened up the door for a much more respectful relationship with governments, and in particular, being able to understand both pieces of the puzzle here, the Western science government approach to things and the Indigenous First Nations approach to dealing with challenges. So Sumas First Nation, on all of the issues that I work with, has exercised their responsibility of their inherent title and rights. And so the department name that I head up, Governance and Natural Resources, typically with other First Nations has the name of Rights and Title, or perhaps Right Title and Natural Resources. So that's kind of the context. Going forward, one of the key things that I'm involved with all levels of government, including the flood issue, is the free, prior, and informed consent. The aspects of reconciliation that have evolved out of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, the adoption by the federal government of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration for Indigenous Peoples, and now in particular, the very unique provincial statute that BC has adopted with respect to DRIPA. Now, to be fair to BC, this is an exercise. It's almost like watching my children grow up. I've got 5 in total, 3 daughters and 2 sons. So I'm privileged on that score to be the father of 5 amazing children. But this is very early stages for the province with respect to DRIPA, because it really reflects I think the well-deserved recognition and an about time comment that I would make with respect to the relationship that the provincial government has to have with all Indigenous peoples right across this province. But to be fair to the province, they're still in, I would call, either their elementary school years, or maybe they're getting to their junior grade 7 years in terms of how do we do this, even on a ministerial basis. And part of that is the challenge, as I said earlier, about the silos and how ministries don't talk with one another. And it's going to take some very, very interested, open-minded individuals at leadership in the provincial government. And I think it's there at this point in time. I'm not making any political comment. I don't belong to any political party, but it is a fairly unique piece of legislation that I would encourage other provinces in the country to start to think about in order to have that proper relationship with the founding peoples of Canada. So when I'm involved in discussions, especially on the flooding piece of the puzzle, we're continuing to develop that relationship and understand what DRIPA is truly going to mean with respect to Sumas First Nation, and in particular, how it's then going to be unfolded within the various medium to long-term flood issues. And they're quite extensive. I think you'll be quite surprised as I get later on into my PowerPoint presentation of the significant money that is going to be coming towards the Sumas Prairie in particular, in order to deal with this major flood event and what it has opened up in terms of what needs to be done at the international, federal, provincial, municipal, and regional government level in cooperation and in consultation. And the key word from my perspective as a lawyer is that we're looking for collaboration, which means equal decision-making for whatever is going to be eventually visited onto the landscape. Next slide, please. So Chief and Council, not surprisingly, we're heavily involved. All of the councillors were involved with addressing community issues on an emergency basis, making sure the elders were taken care of, dealing with flooding of some of the houses. I think at the end of the day, we only ended up with, I think, 2 that were significantly damaged, but those structures were actually on the floodplain. And many First Nations in the country, when the lands were taken away from First Nations, they were relocated on floodplains throughout Canada. And so that's, again, one of the challenges that First Nations in particular have faced as a result of the relocation of their traditional villages and sites. Brian Jones, as I said earlier, the general manager, was heavily involved, and we worked closely as a team in order to interact with the provincial government in particular on a daily 24-hour basis, and then by a week-to-week basis for the 3 weeks that this unfolded. My department, we were blessed with having a fantastic communications officer, Ida Dutt, and so she worked very closely with Brian and I every day to make sure that we were communicating out to the community. Federal government had some involvement in this from a DFO perspective. It was minimal. That's not a criticism, that's just a reality. And then obviously ISK was involved and have been providing financial support going forward, in particular on Kilgard Creek, which runs through the reserve right adjacent to Sumas Mountain Road, and then Kilgard Creek, which emanates up from the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and Mainland and LaForge quarries on Sumas Mountain runs into Marshall Creek, which runs into Sumas River. So, and there was a significant amount of flooding that was occurring, and we had assistance from, I think it was Lafarge in particular, that provided us with sandbags in order to sandbag up where Kilgard Creek was overflowing and was in danger of flooding our health administration building. So thankfully that didn't occur, but again, the assistance of the private sector was greatly appreciated. The province of BC, and I've listed out all the ministries, they didn't have involvement to begin with, but all of these ministries I'm now actively engaged with literally on a weekly basis as a result of the post-flood studies and projects that have resulted. So the Minister of the Environment is now responsible for having hired PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, on all of the sediment removal task force. So they've been particularly front and center with respect to Princeton and Merritt, and obviously the city of Abbotsford and Sumas territories. Agriculture, I had to advocate on behalf of the nation to have them all involved going forward because of the significant soil contamination that resulted from the contaminants that emanated from the flood. So we're looking at fecal matter from livestock operations. We're looking at diesel contamination from, in particular, agriculture, vehicle cars, surfactants coming from, again, agriculture related to pesticides and the berry industry. If most of you don't know it, the Fraser Valley agricultural industry is huge. I've seen numbers from 750 million to over $1 billion a year in annual GDP into the provincial and federal budgets. It's a very significant player. It's I think it's more significant than the Niagara Escarpment, for example, in Ontario. And it's not bigger from a geographic perspective that our farmers on the prairies with respect to canola and wheat production in particular, but it is a very, very significant player. And so if nothing else, I would invite you to go away from this presentation understanding the huge role that agriculture plays in the Fraser Valley. And I'm not advocating for it, but it really is a significant economic driver, but also the importance that they'll pay going forward with First Nations generally in terms of food security issues and how we can get a handle on preventing the kind of contamination that took place. There was a massive fire that took place at the wreck dealership that's at the corner of North Parallel Road and Sumas Mountain Road. And so there was a number of diesel and propane contaminants that got into the water as well. I've talked to a number of specialists, and a lot of it was flushed down river eventually by the Fraser into the Salish Sea. But again, that's not a good thing because those are all contaminants that have then impacted from a negative perspective the aquatic environment. So, the fish and the mammals that survive in there, and that the salmon that are then eventually harvested by First Nations, all will have had an impact either immediately, and they may have impacts on a much more longer term basis. The Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Reconciliation, you have to read that as really EMBC because that wasn't a ministry at the time of the flood. Forests, as I said earlier, has taken a significant lead in terms of pulling together some of the aspects of how government was going to respond. Sumas First Nation was the first in the province that I'm aware of that advocated that a separate secretariat be created by the province to start to pull all these threads together so that we weren't working in these silos. Eventually, the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation may be involved if there's any kind of claims that are made by First Nations throughout the province. A key one that is now at the table, again, at the insistence of Sumas First Nation and myself advocating on behalf of the nation, is MOTI, which is Minister of Transportation Infrastructure. As you're all aware, there's a significant Trans-Canada highway expansion. They've completed 216th, and then now they're going to be working from 216th to 264th. It's regular every evening, 7 days a week in terms of the prep work for the addition to the right-of-way. MOTI is particularly challenged because they don't know what to build now at the Whatcom interchange, because there's a brand new interchange that will be put onto the landscape there. To a lesser degree, it's impacted by Highway 11 and Vi Road, again, because of the adjacency to the risk of the flat land around Zero Avenue and the US-Canada border. I work very closely with MOTI as part of the nation's representative in discussing with MOTI what eventually will that new road system look like from 264th to Whatcom Road. Both the mayor of, the mayors of Chilliwack, Abbotsford, and Chief Silver have advocated very strongly that MOTI doesn't stop at a 1.6 kilometer expansion east of Whatcom Road, but it goes all the way to Chilliwack. Because at this point in time, that's the proposal. And so to be fair to the engineers there and to my discussions to date with them, they're challenged with what kind of a transportation corridor they need to put in place, knowing what the risk is for the next flood. The other thing that I'll share with you now, and I think I'll touch on it a little bit later in the PowerPoint presentation, is the fact that this is a significant economic lifeline, not just for locally in terms of the Fraser Valley and going east or west, but also with respect to the economic driver for the province and then for the country. And so there's a gas pipeline that runs through the flood area. There's an oil pipeline that runs through the flood area. There's a fiber optics communication system that runs through the area. There's BC Hydro right-of-ways, and there's the road itself. And that's on top of everything else in terms of all of the businesses, both individual businesses that were affected by the flood and will be affected in the future, and then also the major agricultural loss that took place with respect to not just infrastructure in terms of barns and houses, but also the significant thousands of lives that were lost in the livestock sector themselves. And then the new ministry that was created prior to the new premier coming on board, which is the Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship. So they have a role as well going forward. So next slide, please. So these were the players that I've identified earlier. So Abbotsford front and center, and I continue to work every single week with the City of Abbotsford engineers in terms of their having to address the 300 separate infrastructure sites that were damaged during the flood. And some of those are on Sumas traditional territory. So we're heavily involved with Tyler Bowie and Mike Kelly in particular. They've been assigned by the City of Abbotsford Mayor and Council and the head engineers to take on the responsibility to address all of those infrastructure damages. And they're only allowed to bring it back to the existing engineering status as of the November flood of 2021. Going forward, the City of Chilliwack, we're involved with them with respect to the Vetter Canal, and I'll get into that in terms of the sediment removal. There's a regional government focus on this one. And as I said, all three of the First Nations, but Sumas First Nation is front and center. They were at ground zero on this one. So naturally, we're involved in every aspect of this, both short, medium, and long term. And so we're, to a large degree, driving the bus on that. And we insisted on inviting our sister First Nations, both Lekamela and Sq'ewá, so that they were able to participate to the degree that they wanted to. And so I'm glad to advise you that they're providing their perspective as well moving forward on the various task forces that are occurring each and every week. Next slide, please. That's just a bird's eye view of what it looked like. And so, you know, it was devastating. But if I could remind everybody, if you're not aware, that there's been floods that have been taking place since the loss of the lake in 1924. Farmers, when they were tilling their fields in 1924, were still discovering live sturgeon deep down in their fields. And that's because the sturgeon are such a resilient species, and they are also able to survive with minimal moisture. So it was quite an amazing telling by the elders of what that was happening a little over 100 years ago. So this is the picture. And again, I would strongly suggest that it's not an if, it's a when in terms of future floods, especially in the what I'm going to call the weak period, which is whatever can be done on an interim mitigation perspective before a final engineering and First Nations solution is achieved with respect to the Nooksack and in terms of water management on the Sumas River. And this is completely separate for everybody on this call to the Fraser River and the diking system that's there. And so Sq'ewá First Nation in particular is very interested in those dikes because of the implications to their community and their traditional lands. We've taken a much more back seat position on that because of the implications to Sq'ewá, but we do have involvement with respect to traditional fishing sites that the nation at Sumas has used for 10,000 years, literally. Next slide, please. So I put emotional trauma front and center because for the knowledge keepers at Sumas First Nation, this was a blessing, but also an emotional trauma in terms of seeing with their own eyes in 2021 the loss of one of their most significant resources, which was Sumas Lake or Sumas Lake. And so, you know, it was wonderful at one level, and I don't want to discount all of the amazing damages that occurred, but at another level, it was the elders being able to see a return to the lake, and they've said that to me on a number of occasions. So I do want to put that front and center in terms of it's a revisit of a painful history, and but it also opened up an opportunity to look at a partial restoration of S'ólh Lake moving forward. And I'll touch on that a little bit later in terms of potential bioengineering and rewilding. So from a flood damage perspective, BC Hydro was significantly put at risk. But I'm happy to advise that there's nations around the world now that have hydro lines running through existing water courses and water courses that are prone to flood, and you can still have that infrastructure on the landscape. The dike itself was breached in 2 locations. A significant breach was the one that was the focus of most of the news attention. And as I said very earlier at the beginning of my presentation, it's only this week that the dike has actually been officially repaired. They had to go and find a technology that was developed in Germany, actually, and they were able to put into the existing work that had been done to date that would basically acted as a catalyst to solidify the dike without actually having to go in and work in the dike itself. So very unique technology. And as I said, I was very fortunate with a great team that I have working with me to be able to go in and actually rescue as many sturgeon and salmon and other fish species as possible. And the city of Abbotsford was very, very, very cooperative with us. And it was very nice to get a call yesterday from Tyler saying that the 2 governance and natural resources staff were awesome. And in my experience as a lawyer and an executive over the last 30 years, it's very rare to get that praise. And so it was nice to hear that. And economic implications were significant. And, my sympathies still extend to this day in terms of the implications of individual landowners, both in terms of what happened to their residences, what happened to the farmers and their livelihoods, and other economic entities in the business community that were severely suffered, either because as a result of the direct impact of the flood or what transpired after the fact in terms of the inability of people to actually have access and egress to businesses throughout the Fraser Valley. I haven't had any kind of a detailed update from the fiber optics companies that operated in the area. The gas and oil pipelines, and in particular the Trans Mountain pipeline, was exposed. The Southern Railway that runs literally right along the southern edge, right next to the US border, was not impacted because of where they're located. So there was obviously significant health and safety issues with respect to everybody throughout that entire flood. And in particular, obviously, I focused in on what we could do from the perspective of assisting community members, but both chief and council, their instructions to me as the head of governance and natural resources was, Richard, from day one, your first focus is health and safety for everybody, not just for the community. And I think that speaks to how First Nations view themselves in terms of being part of BC and Canadian society. And I think it was well received. It was a very significant eye-opener for a number of people who are non-First Nations as to the caring and the sympathy that First Nations are always front and center to help in a disaster, whether it's within their community or outside of it. So my hands go up. And then as well, the last comment was with respect to revisiting the heritage of the nation. And I'm pivoting on respect of that as to how we can eventually have a collaborative decision that shows what we can do to correct a wrong that took place in 1920, but also be clever from an engineering perspective to allow us to be able to put something on the landscape that is nature friendly, that incorporates those cultural, environmental, spiritual, and social values, but is smart from a taxpayer dollar perspective so that we're able to address structures that are on the floodplain, perhaps purchasing some of the floodplain structures. And that's what's certainly happening in other parts of the world. And certainly it's happening big time in the US, both in Washington State and in California. And I'll share a little bit with you about what transpired in the 500-year flood along the Rhine River that affected 5 of the Western European countries. Next slide, please. So from our perspective, what we're now looking at, because the short term's over and done with, I believe that a number of First Nations were provided funding through EMBC, I think in some cases to $120,000 a year in order to provide for bringing emergency management people on board and to try and address through ISK some of the actual damages that occurred to the transportation infrastructure in particular, in terms of the road system and the water treatment systems. As both an executive and a lawyer, I always advocate that we need to look at this from a holistic approach. So, what were the impacts from an atmospheric perspective, from a biosphere perspective, from an ecosphere perspective? I've thrown geomorphology in there because that's a significant one. So for those of you who don't know that, that's really a study of water bodies in nature, both lake and rivers and streams. But what the implications are when, for example, as a society, we engage in clear-cut cutting of the forests, and what the impacts are on the ability of nature from a geomorphology perspective to be able to adapt to not having vegetation cover that then results in mudslides, as an example, and results in increased siltation into the salmon-bearing creeks and brooks and tributaries of the rivers, both major and minor. The geosphere, and that was a little bit like what Ernie had said earlier about the geotechnical implications of the mudslide on the golf course. And so, and then obviously health and safety, because that's paramount. And so I always kind of look at these, and these, if I was going to, draw a diagram for you, I would have these in different circles, but all intersecting in the center in terms of health and safety, but with that First Nations lens, so that we're able to appreciate that we can't operate in a vacuum here. Like, the Sumas River isn't an aquarium. It's part of a flowing of water that eventually ends up in the Salish Sea and the Pacific Ocean. So we really have to start to think about both the intersections and the intercorrelation of our activities as human beings in relation to nature, and do a much better job at, as much as we like to think we can control nature, for us to be able to live with it and adapt to it based on future events, triggered in part by climate change, but also with respect to aging infrastructure. And I think a better awareness as to how we can do things better as a society. Next slide, please. So I put this one on here just to give you a sense of the massive amount of work that is now unfolded as a result of that. I referenced earlier, and I'll drop down to the second last arrow there, the Vedder Canal, which we like to call a man-made Sumas River, realistically, because it was altered in the 1890s by citizens of Chilliwack. I believe there was some Scandinavian woodcutters that actually went up and diverted the river at the time, and that's how we eventually ended up with the Vedder Canal as part and parcel of the overall development of the draining of the lake and the diking that took place. So there was over 435,000 cubic meters of sediment that came down the Chilliwack River. And every year the Vedder is required to, at least on a 3-year basis, figure out how much sediment needs to be removed from there. This became an extraordinary event. And so my department has been working very closely with the city of Chilliwack. We've got a very good relationship with them. It got off to a bit of a rocky start in terms of them not understanding that they had to be consulting with the nation in terms of work on traditional territory, but very quickly that was turned around by David Blaine, and I think now he's the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer, but he was the engineer at the time. So it's a fantastic relationship, and we've worked very closely with Chilliwack and with Kerwood Lydell, who was retained by Chilliwack, and as well their biologists that they had on a consulting basis to try and figure out, from an environmental focus, how they would be able to start to address removal of the sediment from the Vedder Canal. On behalf of Sumas First Nation, and as a lawyer, I'm trained to ask the difficult questions and to identify the weak links in the system. I asked the geomorphologists that the city of Chilliwack had hired, would you in today's 2022 put the Vedder Canal on the landscape? And if so, would you have engineered it the way you did? And the answer from his geomorphology expertise was no. And so I've been starting to raise the issue of, and you'll appreciate this when I get to the literally the billions of dollars that are now being thrown around for water management on the Sumas Prairie, is to perhaps do something completely different. And if you're starting from square one, and I'm always a big advocate of that, to kind of think outside the box, perhaps we would put a Vedder Canal in as a brand new river. So it actually looks more natural, and it's actually able to address the water management flow that needs to be required, but at the same time have a much better environment for aquatic species and for bird life. Most of you may not know that this system, the Vedder Canal and the Chilliwack River, is the second most heavily fished river in the entire country. So it gives you a sense of the magnitude of the benefit that is derived by the province and by recreational fishers, as opposed to the loss of the ability of First Nations, and in particular Sumas First Nation, to be able to access their traditional food sources. I go back up to Claiborne Creek. So Claiborne Creek, the headwaters of that are up at the top of Sumas Mountain. Very interesting studies were done, commissioned again, and I have to give kudos to the city of Abbotsford. They hired KWL to look at the species at risk that are on top of Sumas Mountain and came up with at least 10 of those. That includes the mountain beaver, the phantom orchid, the western painted turtle, the red-legged frog, the Oregon forest snail, and there's a number of others that I don't want to get into detail on, but it gives you a significance of the biodiversity at the top of Sumas Mountain. One of the interesting things that has come out of this, and all of these that are identified on this slide for you are all independent task force that I'm sitting on with my governance and policy officer, Philippa Dutt, on behalf of the nation in order to influence wise decision-making going forward with respect to the mediation work and mitigation work that needs to be done. During the flood event, Claiborne Creek was unfortunately flooded. There was a massive amount of siltation that came down from the top of the mountain and required, at one point in time, there were Army engineers in there to sandbag. And again, from a health and safety perspective, Chief and Council authorized the removal of the sediment, but that killed, we don't know how many thousands of salmon eggs and salmon fry in order to address this health and safety concerns of the residents of Claiborne Village, but also the farmers that were downstream of that as Claiborne Village, Creek headed towards the Fraser River. So it was obviously going to potentially impact Sq'ewá First Nation as well. So again, that was the focus. But going forward, we're now involved in detailed discussions with PricewaterhouseCoopers. KWL was retained by PwC to provide the engineering and bio assays on how we would do a better Claiborne Creek going forward. My two key concerns on Claiborne Creek are the siltation with respect to the impacts on the salmon species, and then contamination. Unfortunately, the Ministry of the Environment mandate that was given to PwC is not allowing PwC to engage in what I had requested them to do, which was to find the actual source of the sediment that's upstream at the headwaters. And so we may be put in a position where we're not spending taxpayer dollars wisely, because we're going to continue to see siltation taking place every single year. And so it makes more sense to me that we would actually address the problem as opposed to putting the Band-Aid on the problem. But that's for further discussion as we continue to try and massage what the eventual endeavors will be on that. Our focus is to look at it from putting in vegetation that would have been there prior to any colonization in the area. So literally going back to pre-Samath people days in terms of what the vegetation would look like from a flora perspective. So we're doing that in order to encourage an environment that would benefit salmon, especially the juvenile ones, because that's a creek that has salmon and steelhead in it. It's a very, very healthy creek, and it's interesting from my perspective because it very quickly morphs into an economic driver in terms of the agriculture activities that take place there. We're interested in, and we've been blessed to receive verbal confirmation of some grants going forward from the federal government to do some habitat restoration on Claiborne Creek. And my eventual wish is to collaborate on a joint venture with Sq'ewá First Nation to rehabilitate the whole creek, including the 2 pump stations that are on the Fraser River that are on Sq'ewá First Nation's territory. Kilgard Creek, as I mentioned earlier, is the one that runs directly through the community. It starts up where the 2 quarries are and where the Trans Mountain Pipeline tank farm is. As many of you know, Samath First Nations suffered significant damages to the environment when the Trans Mountain tank farm suffered a leak. And so that was finally resolved with the company. Unfortunately, if you look back in time on this, if we were able to, say we wouldn't want things to happen, is that The activity of the tank farm in conjunction with the both quarries has significantly altered the natural hydrology of the area, including Kilgard Creek. And Kilgard Creek is a fish-bearing creek. Every year I see coho migrating up to spawn. And so our challenge going forward is to come up with a rehabilitation project from a habitat perspective. And then the challenge, just in terms of dealing with it from a nation perspective, is that the majority of Kilgard Creek is on reserve, which is not part of my responsibility, but the headwaters and the source of the water is ancestral traditional territory. So there's an extra step that I have to take in terms of making sure that what we come up with from a habitat restoration piece directly related to the flood is incorporated into what the general manager needs to do on behalf of the community. So eventually we'll have a public meeting on that. ISK came to the table in order to provide remedial work with the replacement of culverts and with respect to a widening of the bank of Kilgard Creek in order to mitigate future floods. But at the same time, we're involved from a governance and natural resources perspective to do recommendations with respect to the placement of those culverts going forward, but also with respect to the vegetation. Many of you know that the blackberries that are in the Fraser Valley are an invasive species. They were actually brought over by the Hudson's Bay Company. And so the Himalayan blackberry is not conducive to providing appropriate fauna and flora refuge along our creeks and tributaries. So as we move forward on a habitat restoration perspective from the nation, we're involved with the removal of the Himalayan blackberry and planting native species. And again, this comes about as a result of what's happened during the flood event. So a positive from my perspective. So there's a whole bunch of negatives. I'm not trying to downplay that, but I'm really one of these people that want to look forward into the future and take advantage of what's been presented to us in today's world. McKay Creek was a very interesting one, and McKay Creek was the one that allowed me to really challenge the Minister of the Environment and PwC to not call this sediment removal, because Claiborne Creek is definitely sediment, but it's also rounded what we would call gravel that you would, if you put your hand in a creek, you would see that. Kilgard Creek was much the same. It was sand particles and small gravel particles. McKay Creek, that resulted from a blast that took place in 2018 on the quarry. And so there were significant rocks that eventually were unstable upslope. And some of those rocks, when I did a field trip just on a day with my communications officer to take pictures, it took me 2 hands to pick up the rocks. Most of them I could pick up in 1 hand. That's not, in my opinion, in dictionary sediment. So PwC and the Ministry of the Environment are revisiting, what they're classifying as sediment. And we're going to have to work directly with the quarry in question to get a better appreciation of what the risks are going forward, not just from a habitat restoration perspective, because we've received some funding from the federal government to do that as well, but also from, again, being smart, because when McKay Creek came down during the atmospheric river event, it pushed out into the middle of the Sumas River, and then eventually that flow started to weaken the bank of Sumas River to the point that it got the attention of the engineers at Abbotsford and at the provincial level that it could endanger the dike. So again, part of my overall message to the group here is that everything is interrelated here, and something that we may not think of has a significant implication, especially downstream when it comes to water. The Sumas River is very, very interesting, because it's only this week, after we've been participating in the Sumas River Sediment Removal Task Forces, that we were advised that this is a significant sediment removal. And I'm not calling that anymore. And the reason is that we're now talking about bank stabilization. There's 1.5 kilometers of the Sumas River that has been significantly damaged. I think the percentage was 40%, needs to be directly addressed with a hardening of the bank. And that was my earlier comment to everybody on the call here, that I've been fighting a bit of an uphill battle at this point in time, or downstream, however you want to call it, or upstream, with respect to the engineering focus only on this, that they want to put something on the landscape, they being the provincial government through their consultants and PwC, that is going to be a minimum of 10 years and maybe 20 years in duration. So my response to that is, if it's 10 years, that's that's a 2 provincial cycle government. It's a 3 provincial cycle with respect to chief and council. And if you start to morph beyond that, if they get their wish at the 20-year range, and I'm not saying they in any kind of pejorative manner, we're looking at a generation. With the thought is that we need to be smart on these temporary mitigation measures with respect to flood infrastructure, because some of what they're proposing will eventually have to be completely removed. And so you do have to take into account in terms of what different options are going to be presented on the Sumas River with respect to the armoring of the bank. So this is morphed into between 10 and maybe as high as 17 to 18 million dollars as a standalone sediment removal task force. And there's an expediency required to this in order to eliminate the danger to the dike. It has the same number value of 10 to 18 million dollars of the bank stabilization program that Sumas First Nation is participating on with the city of Abbotsford and the provincial government. There's a memorandum of understanding between all 3 parties with respect to armoring the Fraser River, but at the same time enhancing or preserving traditional fishing sites of the Sumas fishers. So it's taken on a much bigger magnitude just in terms of the ability of Governance and Natural Resources to be able to address this with the provincial representatives and the city of Abbotsford representatives. So this will take on a bigger life of its own, because the other ones truly are at this point in time sediment removal, with the exception of McKay Creek, obviously. I put the Vetter Bridge on there. There was a significant amount of debris that accumulated around the Vetter Bridge, and so we participated in the earlier removal of that bridge. And at one point in time, I believe portions of the Trans-Canada Highway westbound had to be closed off in order for the work to continue on that. Next slide, please. Hopefully I'm on time and I'm not. Let me know if you need to yank me off the stage. So.
I just wanted to, we have Michael Suedfeld here from Sq'ewá to talk about the impact of the atmospheric river there. And I know he has to leave in about 30 minutes. But about how much more did you have to share, or can he add in and jump on in?
Well, I'm happy to step down because I can continue after the fact. So in order to have, it's not an issue. I had devoted the 2 hours, so I'm
good, wonderful.
No worries.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect point to add in, have Michael share how things were upriver with the work with Helix Cacao. We have our upriver communities and businesses along the Fraser, and then we have our midriver. So Michael, if you'd like to share what took place upriver, and perfect timing and Cook's Gym. Thank you, Richard. Absolutely amazing information, and it just gets us thinking about what we need to do and supporting our communities in businesses, entrepreneurs in community and out community. So take it away, Michael, and Cook's Gym for being here. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Suedfeld. I am the office manager at Sq'ewá or Sq'ewá First Nation. We're located about halfway between Agassiz and Hope on Highway 7. And during the atmospheric rivers in November of 2021, our community was actually cut off in both directions. There were landslides just outside of Hope, and this one, which was just on the other side of Ruby Creek heading towards Agassiz. So all of the staff who generally would help out and who would run our emergency operations center were not on site when the atmospheric river occurred and the landslides took place. It happened on a weekend. So essentially, none of the people who would ordinarily step in to take charge and operate emergency operations were available to do so in person. And what happened was, as the weather got worse and the landslides occurred, there was a traffic backup along Highway 7, just stranded motorists everywhere. And people began to pull into our parking lot. Ruby Creek has a fairly large administrative building. It's fairly visible, and we have a large generator. So we were actually one of the only lit sort of buildings on the highway at that time. Power was out. The landslide took out, I believe it was 13 power poles and a wide variety of telecommunications poles. So it was very hard to sort of have any external communications for the first day or so. And it was mostly, the chief essentially went and opened up the building and brought in about 75 people the first night, just because they were stranded in the parking lot, and somebody knocked on her door and asked if they could use the washroom. And she went out and realized there was all these people stranded. Sq'ewá only has 7 members who actually live on reserve. And then we have 2 trailer parks with about 75 residents in total. Most of our membership lives either off like residential area around Sq'ewá, and a lot of them live south of the border in the United States. So we didn't have a lot of membership on site. We didn't have any of our employees on site, and it essentially fell to the chief and a few other people to look after, like I said, about 75 stranded motorists the first evening. So it ended up becoming basically the hall. We have a large hall. It was opened up. It became home to these people for the few days that they were there. It was basically from Sunday to about Thursday. It was the only lit building, as I said, within several kilometers. If you know the area, Suedfeld is about 5 kilometers further towards Hope on Highway 7. Seabird's about 5 kilometers the other way. We couldn't get to Seabird. We did have some ability to share supplies with Suedfeld and Camp Hope, which still had people at it from the fires in Lytton the year before. So Diane can tell you all about those fires. She ran the EOC there. But nevertheless, there was still supplies there. So we were able to tap in and share some resources with our neighbors. The chief, being a very strong chief with a very strong leadership component, quickly took charge and basically brought everything under control. So what happened was that essentially under her leadership, the travelers sort of organized themselves into different crews. So there were people who were cooking, there were people who were cleaning, there were men who were out in the parking lot sort of moving water around and trying to make things livable. People were looking after the kids. Luckily enough, among the people who were stranded there, we had 2 nurses and a doctor. One of the nurses works for Stalo Service Agency, so was very familiar with the community. So, some of those things kind of worked out very luckily for us. But in general, what we found was a complete drain on all of the resources that we had saved up for an emergency. So when we look at the impacts, it was sort of exactly what you might have expected the impacts to be, which is if you had a bunch of people stranded, without any real medical emergencies occurring or any immediate threat to their life, they just go through a lot of stuff. So we had, I think about $5,000 to $8,000 worth of food that we went through in 3 or 4 days. The washrooms were completely destroyed in the process. Not destroyed, but there was a lot of mess left around. There's a lot of dirt and stuff to clean up afterwards. We went through a lot of emergency sort of the basic medical stuff and toilet paper and sanitary napkins and all that stuff that we'd had was essentially raided fairly extensively over that period of time. So we learned that we needed to have more food on hand for sure, and that it's really important to organize people. And if you can keep them organized and give them some purpose while they're stranded, they react a lot better than if they just sit around bored and starting to kvetch at each other and that thing and get on each other's nerves. So there was very little of that, but it was because they had assigned roles and they had things to do. And there were rules in place around lights out and those things. So everybody was kind of encouraged to work together. And for that short period of time was able to do so. How things would have looked if it had gone on for another week or so, I can't really say, but I doubt it would have been as pleasant. I think the important thing here is really kind of what we learned from this. And it's applicable whether you're in a small community or you're running a business, because at the end of the day, if you have a stranded traveler or passenger or whatever there, you're going to do your best to help them. So whatever resources you have, you're going to use. So if you own a restaurant and you have stranded people, you're going to use all your food to feed them. So it's that sort of looking at like, what do you have and what can you offer people in an emergency situation? And so what we learned from this was quite a number of things. We didn't have anybody who lived on site who was a trained emergency operations center person. So our first step was to enlist some local volunteers who actually live in our trailer parks. They're not Indigenous people, they're not members of the nation, but they are interested in protecting the community and the people who live there. So we now have those volunteers in place, and we're training them to sort of be our substitute emergency operations center if staff isn't available. And when we look at, we're only on site 4 days a week for 8 hours at a time. So 32 out of 168 hours a week, about 20% of the time, there's actually staff at the site. The rest of the time, there isn't. So the vast majority of the time, a catastrophe or disaster will occur when there's nobody there to actually operate the EOC. So that was the first thing we had to address. The second thing we realized is that, of course, transportation links are very easily severed. Normally, Sq'ewá could have evacuated people by boat. We're right on the river. But because of the atmospheric river and the mudslides, the Fraser was just full of timber, and there was no way you could have navigated any kind of small boat in there at all. And we couldn't get through on the highway in either direction. So essentially completely cut off from the world for 4 days. Our real concern at that point was that somebody would have a medical emergency that we couldn't address, or somebody would run out of medications because we had no way of getting them refills. So what we've done to address that partially is we purchased 2 side-by-sides, heavy duty as we could find. And the thinking there is that if we do have another event of this kind, those side-by-sides are heavy duty enough to get out past what those mudslides were at that time. Of course, we could run into a more difficult situation that would render them useless as well, but we can't really predict beyond what we have, and we can't afford a helicopter, which I think would be our only other option. We weren't prepared for emergencies, as I said, medical emergencies, sorry. So since then, we have purchased an AED, an automatic external defibrillator, if in case anybody had a heart condition or a heart attack or any other kind of episode like that. All of our staff have taken first aid training and CPR training since the event, and we've increased we've actually upped our available medical supplies. So now the one issue that we would really be scared of is somebody running out of medication, and that's not really something that we can do anything about, because you can't just have an endless supply of various medications lying around. We had no facilities for people to take showers or wash their clothing. So we've actually installed showers and a washer and dryer now, industrial washer and dryer, in case we run into such an event again. The hall got a little smelly after 4 days of nobody being able to have a shower. When you're in that condition or that position, you don't worry about that too much, but people were clearly feeling it. Power is very important. So we're actually looking at adding a second generator just in case. We realized we had 1,000 liters of fuel on hand for our generator. That's enough to run it for about 2 weeks. We had it running fully for 5 days for people, and we still had a little over half our fuel left. So it worked really well. Any rural community with an administrative building should probably have a large scale generator on hand for situations like this. And food is also power. Like, if people can't eat and get water, we're in big trouble. So we had enough food to get through the 5 days. We would have been able to get through about another 4 or 5 days. After that, it would have been pretty touch and go. We would have been banging on doors, asking residents what they had, etc. People were bringing food out of their cars, whatever they had with them, they were sharing with everybody. So it was very cooperative and collaborative. But again, that was while things were still in fairly good shape. Had stuff started deteriorated, when you run out of food, you run out of power, medical emergencies happen, things could go sideways quite rapidly. So that's something we're also trying to sort of say, like, what would happen if this was a longer term event? What else could we do? And so we're putting in some little things like the washers and dryers and showers and stuff, but not really able to address really large scale, long-term emergencies, and realizing that if such a thing occurs, we're going to have to fend the best we can for as long as we can, I think. So, I mean, that's not a very cheery way to look at things, but it is kind of reality for us, being in that area and cut off the way that we were during that time. As far as the impact on business, we only have one business on the site. It's an art gallery, so it wasn't particularly impacted one way or the other. But I would say, as I mentioned earlier, that if you own a business or operating businesses and an emergency happens, just be aware those resources in the business then become resources to help alleviate whatever the emergency is in whatever way that you can use them. And recouping funds comes through that emergency management BC program with all the numbers and that kind of thing that, again, Diane knows way more about than I do, so I won't go into it. But that program did work fairly successfully for us. We were able to replace most of our supplies very rapidly. We got funding for the side-by-sides that we purchased. We did pay for the AED, I think, out of our own resources, but they're like $3,000, I think. Food supplies were resupplied. We were able to get grants to put in the showers and the washer and dryers. We cannot get money for generators, and that is one thing that people should realize. EMBC will not provide money for generators that we could find. So buy your own. But that is one thing that I would really recommend people do. And always a clean supply of water and lots of food lying around. So we've actually bought like space type rations now that can be reconstituted for a longer term emergency if we had to go for several weeks. They're not very tasty from what I understand, but they will keep you going. So, yep, that's about all I have to say. Happy to answer any questions. We did not have any medical emergencies. We didn't have any fights or anything like that. It actually went fairly smoothly. I will say the one thing, at the end, we had a post-mortem where we gathered around and sort of said, you know, what worked, what didn't work. And our chief said, who ran the whole thing, our emergency plan didn't work. Okay, so our emergency plan is like 160 pages, has all these lovely charts and appendices and information about who to call and what to do. And in an emergency, nobody's going to look at that thing. So, and of course, people might read them when they first get them, but then they go on your desk somewhere or in a drawer somewhere and you never look at it again. So what I have asked, I was in a meeting yesterday with the First Nations Health Authority. We were talking about emergency planning, and I've asked them to create a very quick diagrammatical grid of sort of a flow chart for emergencies, you know, that sort of highlights those things around protecting life, protecting first responders, protecting assets in that order, with a sort of if this, then do this kind of logic flow to it. And they were actually very interested. So I'm hoping that's something that will come out of this, is a way of managing your emergency operations that's a little bit simpler just to follow in the event of the actual emergency, so that you don't have to like do a lot of recall or search through guides or anything. It's just these basic steps to protect lives. That's our number one priority, is to protect everybody's life. So once we've done that, then what do we do? Now we're going to protect property. Okay, how do we do that? So just so that it's a little more simple. And so I'm hoping that they're going to come up with something that's very indigenized, that will work for communities, because we did find that was a problem. The emergency plan did work. Nobody died, and we didn't lose any assets. So in that respect, it worked. But in the respect of the person using it being comfortable with it, that didn't work. So that's something we're looking to address. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. I'm sorry if I spoke really quickly. I do have another meeting that I have to get to in about the next 15 minutes, but I'm happy to answer any questions for a few minutes if people have any. Thank you, Diane.
Yeah, Cook's Jam. Yes, questions. Amazing. We're so fortunate today to hear upriver and in midriver. So let's ask some questions for Michael. We just have a couple. All right. Were there any business owners that were stranded and staying, to your knowledge?
I honestly don't know. It wasn't something that came up because we were really just more or less concerned about like the medical end of things. Like, so I know that Chief Chapman, Maureen Chapman, who's our chief, had, you know, sort of when people came in and asked them if they had any skills around cooking. I think we had somebody who was, you know, an actual chef, other skills around like medical and attending to people and that kind of thing. But I don't think she asked about any business background. We did have a couple of people with financial background because there was discussion around how to recoup some of our costs and stuff.
Okay. Oh, Rocio?
Hi,
Thank you,
Rocio.
Michael. Good to see you.
You too.
We appreciate, you know, this information to help us understand some of the impacts, because I live in Hope and I was part of being in the island of Hope with all these roads around us closed off. But, you know, you were talking about the emergency plan that you had that was 160 plus some pages, whatever it was. So was another written plan developed, or you didn't do a new one at all? I don't know if I missed that or not.
So what we're working on now is trying to actually just create like a simpler grid for people to follow in the case of an emergency, so that things flow logically for them, just focusing on protecting lives, up to evacuation. And then if you don't need to evacuate, then what do you do to protect those other things within the community? But just making it as simple as we can, because the plan has like all these, I mean, it's actually a really comprehensive plan. There's lots of really great information in there. If you have time to sit down and absorb all that and, you know, really put it into practice and do tabletops and everything, it's awesome. But if you're just strictly faced with an emergency and your mind kind of doesn't know what to do first, I want somebody to be able to look at the wall and say, save lives, protect life, right? That's my number one priority. How do I do that? I got to get everybody into this area because that's a safe area. Okay, how do I do that? Right, that kind of thing. So that's what we're looking at more now, as opposed to this sort of lengthy because right now it's just very, you know, transfer of command and so does this and so does that, which is all good once you can get so-and-so's on site. But if so-and-so's are 50 kilometers away, it doesn't do a damn thing. Right? It's yelling in the wind at that point. So yeah, so really making a plan that works for people who've never seen a plan before is what we're after now. And that's what I was engaging with FNHA on yesterday. And they have like graphic artists and stuff who can do that type of work. So it'll be interesting to see what they come up with.
That's awesome. Thanks, Michael. And I think that that's really applicable on, you know, for the entrepreneurs, whether they're, you know, majority of the time they're solopreneurs or whatever, it's still a good idea to have a plan in place. And that's what the whole purpose of what we're doing and why we're doing, and bringing you and Richard and all of these great speakers in with Diane to share the knowledge about what has worked, what has not, how can we advise to be prepared. And so this is very, very helpful information. Much appreciated.
It's very much that, you know, sort of keep it simple, stupid approach to doing things. We get very complicated, especially as we become more knowledgeable about something. We build complication into it because we know. But when then somebody comes along who doesn't have that knowledge and they're faced with it, it's too complicated. So it's like, how do we simplify that for everybody?
Absolutely. Thank you.
I think Ernie has his hand up.
Hi, Michael. How you doing?
Good. How are you, Ernie?
I'm not too bad. My throat's a little sore, but it feels like my air is drying at home. But I'm doing well. I'm just curious about the water supply, and also the I'm on our emergency response team at Chiam here. I just got sent to it like the other day, but and I've seen this on Facebook, so I signed up with Diane. But in terms of water supply and food rationing and also I mean, you look at your pyramid, right? You need water and food and shelter and such, and responsibility. I like how you presented your thing, but how is your guys' water supply up there? You guys got wells, or was it like?
Yeah, we have wells, but because we had the generator, we were able to keep power and pumping. The sewage septic system did overflow at one point, and they had to go out and actually there is a way to manually drain it or reset it so that it drains. So that did happen. And that was one of those things where nobody knew what to do. And they actually did the wrong thing. It ended up working out not too badly, but had they not then reversed and done the right thing, it could have really screwed up our system. So part of our process, Ernie, is that we have what we call a maintenance manual. And within that, we do step-by-steps of how to do things. And so another lesson that we learned from that is we have now a step-by-step how to reset the sewage system. And it's posted right where all the sewage system controls are. So that ever happen again, somebody would just be able to look at this chart. It's all in graphics. And oh yeah, I have to turn this here. I have to turn this pump here. Punch this button, we're good to go, right? But those are the lessons learned, is what we didn't know, and that could have been disastrous. But we didn't run out of water. We do have a supply of bottled water as well, had we needed. There was food rationing around some of the goods. We had a lot of flour on hand as well, so they could have baked bannock or bread if they needed to, but instead the rationing did kind of carry people through. But yes, that was a very important thing, was to say, hey, like, let's not go whole hog and have big banquets every night. You know, you get one sandwich for lunch, that's it, right? Wow. So there was some of that happening for sure.
Nice. And then on the other side, I mean, like, I seen that we were just down the road from you guys, and, and the highway traffic just changed all of a sudden as it goes through our reserve. but have we seen helicopters going by regularly? Were they delivering medicals and food and stuff like that to your community, or?
I think they did to Sq'ewá. I'm not sure there's anybody on from Sq'ewá today, but I think Diane seems to know. We didn't get anything by helicopter. They had asked us if we needed anything, I believe. But at that time, we were still doing okay. We do have a large enough site that a helicopter could land there if necessary, if weather conditions permitted.
The helicopters were going back and forth to deliver supplies to Hope. Know that the district of Hope had thousands and thousands of stranded motorists. We did have food through the resource, not through EMBC, but through the resource of Camp Hope, as that's where the EOC was, and so we had 217 stranded motorists at Camp Hope for 4 days, and so yeah, we got food helicoptered in there, and not only there was also helicopters going up and down to Lytton and the canyon.
Yeah, and we had good cooperation with Camp Hope and Sq'ewá throughout that.
Oh, thank you. That's just incredible. It's quite the story.
It was. I wish I'd been there, and kind of happy I wasn't. It would have been nice to be able to take charge and actually help Maureen out, Chief Chapman out, but at the same time, I was home with my wife, nice and cozy, so it was okay for my ends.
You could have been very well stuck up there and pulling out the pullout on Maureen's.
That's right.
I know if there isn't any more questions, I was wondering if there's any message for our current business owners and future business owners of what can they do as an entrepreneur and their emergency planning. What's a couple messages you would leave with them on what steps they do as a community member, as an entrepreneur in community or outside of community in the traditional lands of our mainland Coast Salish communities?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier was that just, if an emergency occurs, those business assets become emergency supplies more than they are business assets for people. Hopefully that business owners look at it from that perspective and that they're able to recoup whatever they've given out at a later time. I also think that it's important to have some emergency supplies on hand. I know, I believe in New York, every restaurant has an AED in it. And you don't see them very often in Canadian restaurants because people very often, that's where they have heart attacks is right after or during eating, apparently. So those kinds of things we maybe should be looking at, but I'm not an expert enough to know whether that's a cost versus benefit ratio, it works out well or not in a city like Chilliwack. It's, it maybe works fine in a city the size of New York, I'm not sure, but whether it would be practical here, given the expense, I couldn't say. I just think it's really wise for people to understand basic first aid. Everybody should have basic first aid. Everybody should have some emergency supplies in their back of their car, something to eat and drink if you get stranded. So they're not maybe directly related to business, but just, how we should act as members of society and how we should conduct ourselves as responsible individuals and look after our own needs to whatever extent we're able. I think a lot of times we get very dependent on other people to look after us. We're like, oh my God, the government will come along and help us if we have an emergency. And the fact is, where we were, the government couldn't come along and do anything. They were on their own. So yeah, we can anticipate what people want to do in an emergency to help, but it's not always possible. So that's a really good lesson that we took away, was be prepared to be more self-sufficient.
Wonderful. That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, and really appreciate your knowledge and sharing, and looking after the new members for the 4 days that you had in your community. And our community is right, and we're just all step up. So thank you, Michael. And
they all had a story to tell.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm gonna go to my other appointment, but I thank everybody for listening to me this morning, and wish you the rest of a good day and a great weekend. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Awesome. That's amazing. Okay, Richard, are you ready?
Ready to go. Hopefully, Diane, I haven't worn out my welcome, and because I have been speaking a lot, so hopefully it's going to be of value to the group. So I'll try and speed it up a little bit. So
yep.
So what's going forward here, and that's why I've kind of called it the long term, we could easily refer to it as the future, is that there's currently negotiations going on led by the province, but as a result of the interactions with Sumas First Nation and the city of Abbotsford to put together a legally binding memorandum of understanding to deal with the issues as it relates to what I'm calling the water management approach, but it really is going to focus in on the Sumas Prairie. To be fair to the lead on this, which is the city of Abbotsford, from a engineering perspective at this point in time, they really need to know, but we all need to know, is what the Americans are going to do with respect to flood mitigation measures that will occur on the Nooksack. So that's the G5 that's there. So myself and one of my staff, and actually Cheyenne, who's on the call here, my amazing executive assistant, we're participating on what's called the Transboundary Task Force, and that's to look at the intersection and intercorrelation with the Nooksack in relation to a future flood event with respect to coming north of the 49th parallel. So both of those are in the works. I literally have a G4/G5 meeting from 2 to 4 this afternoon. So it's starting to ramp up fairly quickly. They're envisioning having a technical table, a policy table, and then a leadership table. So the leadership table would be state of Washington and the provincial government, and presumably the mayor of Abbotsford as an example, and at least Chief Dalton Sofer, and perhaps the chief from the Camel, not sure yet, or from Matsqui. And then I'm sitting on both the technical and the policy committees as they move forward in scope. What is needed though in all of these is that, and I always try and explain to people that as First Nations become more sophisticated in terms of how they have to be able to deal with the multitude of issues that are facing them, it comes down to dollars, quite frankly. So the First Nations need to have the capacity. And so I'm blessed with a team of 6, but I'm going to have to hire another biologist moving forward on our habitat restoration piece of the puzzle, but I'm also going to hire a full-time research officer and coordinator for all of these projects as we move forward, because on the rest of or if I look at it as a roundtable, the other people around the room at the provincial level and the municipal level have significant resources that they can bring to bear. So, and that requires the ability to have financial resources to engage external legal counsel, engage an external engineering consultant, and perhaps some aspects of consulting with respect to the socio-economic implications of the gray infrastructure as it relates to Sumas First Nation and Indigenous values and cultures. Next slide, please. We've talked about that, so I can skip over that one. But again, it was to paint the picture for you. I'm not even going to go through this one. So, and that didn't come out. Well, sorry, if I can make the one comment on that, that's not as a result of me having too many martinis at the Cactus Club. This is really about trying to encapsulate what we were looking at initially from the atmosphere, biosphere, ecosphere, and geosphere perspective. I would invite you to take a peek at that one, in particular for the people who are on the call that are interested from a business perspective. There might be something that you can identify on that you could move forward with. I certainly think in the medium to long term, there'll be significant business opportunities as infrastructure starts to work its way into the system. For example, the Sumas River armoring of the bank is going to be an opportunity there. The bank stabilization program that I referred to earlier will be one. And then the big elephant in the room is, at this point in time, the minimum cost for the Sumas Prairie that is being advocated by the city of Abbotsford. Now, I will hasten to add that at this point in time, that is not agreed to in any way, shape, or form by Sumas First Nation. But the lower end on that one is basically $2.75 billion in terms of a brand new multiple Sumas River pump stations. So there's obviously significant economic offshoots from that at some point in time. So next slide, please. So, and again, if you recall earlier, my focus from an executive and a legal perspective is that we truly need to see First Nations at the table in a collaborative aspect. Historically, the court cases have strongly emphasized consultation as part of the puzzle, but First Nations in BC are particularly unique because, with a very few exceptions, most of BC was not ceded legally with respect to treaties. And so certainly on behalf of Samath, we're seeking to be equal decision makers at those tables. So from a government to government basis for dealing with the provincial government, or if I go to a 3G model, government to government to government, which is the province, ourselves and the municipal governments. And if I do the 4G, then we're either looping in the feds, and if it's a 5G, we're looping in our American neighbors. I've talked about the significant opportunity here for green rewilding. So for any businesses that are potentially looking at doing something like this, strong opportunity in the future for infrastructure projects right across the country, but certainly in BC, as we start to look at quote unquote managing Mother Nature, but with a different perspective. And so as I referred to earlier, that includes the purchase of infrastructure buildings that are currently on the floodplain. I had a very interesting conversation with Jason Wang, who's one of the VPs at the Pacific Salmon Foundation, and he's quite keen on being able to provide future generations and of farmers and people who aspire to be farmers that they get government funding in part to allow their land in question to be flooded on an as-needed basis, and that would provide a bit of a down payment for those farmlands, because we all know that those prices have gone up significantly, and it would be an interesting way to combine encouragement in the agricultural sector and people participating, as we all need farmers at the end of the day. That's what we have at our tables morning, noon, and night. And then, but at the same time, having an interesting opportunity with respect to encouraging a different bioengineering component to how we manage our time on the earth with respect to nature. There's a couple of ones that I wanted to refer to in terms of innovative approaches globally. The first one was the Rhine River flood. It was a 1 in 500 year event. And for those who don't know, the hydrologists and geomorphologists and the water engineers refer to like 1 in 10 year floods, 1 in 50 year floods. Those are what are expected to occur in that time frame. The Rhine flood, which has occurred very recently, resulted in significant damage in Western Europe. And so as a result of that, the the country leadership of all 5 of those countries, Belgium, France, Germany, Holland, and Switzerland, got together to start to look at how they would manage the Rhine River in flood capacity, but using a more nature focus on that. And so that has included the ability to flood farmland at certain periods of time. It includes the ability for different kinds of vegetation. It certainly includes a relook at the existing dikes and whether they can do things differently from either a cosmetic perspective or from a biological perspective for the aquatic environment, and sediment removal. And all 5 of those countries have imposed, I think, a certain number of euros that have to be paid every single year by the citizens. And I don't know the number, but I've heard it might be as high as over 3,000 euros a year that's based into whatever taxes that they pay in each of those individual countries. Obviously, Holland is an expert in diking, and so it was quite interesting from my perspective that they took a lead on this one. The other one I wanted to share with you was as a result of my discussion with the Pacific Salmon Foundation. So California decided to embark on a pilot projects to actually enable the fields in the agricultural system, and specifically in relation to rice cultivation, to flood. And that has benefited the salmon in the US and trout as well. And they're actually finding that the salmon are growing larger because of how this has come about. So next one, and I think we're getting pretty close to the end. So this is kind of a new reality. So we've got to think about the aquifers, in particular the Fraser Valley, and the contamination that has been occurring literally since day one in terms of industrial and agricultural development and residential infrastructure on the land. We've got the concept of the droughts that we've experienced and the groundwater basins. And groundwater basins are now being looked at much more closely in terms of how they can facilitate society's response to flooding. And in particular, it's now front and center in California, because one of the concerns that has arisen in California is the issue of not as significant as Oregon and Washington State, but how forestry has been occurring and the contribution of forestry to the increased susceptibility to mudslides and floods. now the inability of the aquifers in California to be recharged because they've reached dangerously low levels because of the drought conditions that they've been suffering for a couple of decades now, in particular in the southwestern US. There's the issue of being able to better manage what kind of human activity and infrastructure takes place on floodplains. And I'm going to be challenging, and the nation will be challenging, whatever eventually is agreed to for the Sumas Prairie water management for the 3 watersheds, that we need to be taking a different look at the floodplains. That includes, as I had said much earlier, that potentially looking at a partial restoration of Sumas Lake in order for it to be able to deal with the ebbs and flows of significant rainfall events. Mountain snowpacks, most people don't realize the extent to which mountain snowpacks interrelate with the entire economic livelihood of our province and our individual municipalities and businesses in terms of when that snow melts and how it interrelates then with the need for that fresh water, not just from nature's perspective for the wildlife and the aquatic life, but also with respect to economic activity. Soils are on there because, as I said earlier, there was a significant implication with respect to contamination of a number of different contaminants and pesticides and hydrocarbons during the flood. And I think if most of you have not seen, I would encourage you to go take a look at Raincoast Foundation. Dr. Peter Ross wrote a very interesting study that was released at Sumas First Nation last fall and had coverage by the mass media with respect to the amount of pharmaceuticals and cocaine that was found in the water testing that he did at various spots throughout the Sumas Prairie. Again, the last one refers to terrestrial cover and capacity to, when we have a chance, let's replant native species. Let's not bring into the territories traditionally on First Nations and on off First Nations lands and traditional territories flora that we like because it's pretty or it's the next best thing from a designer perspective. Let's encourage species that were there 200, 300, 400, 500 years ago. Next slide, please. And that's it. So I just wanted to obviously indicate, really the privilege that I have to represent Chief Silver and Councillor Ganzeveld, Silver and Tuttle, and Murray Ned, who's a special tribal and government relations advisor. It really is a privilege as a non-First Nation individual to be able to advocate and represent and speak on behalf of the nation. I report directly to Chief Silver and to Councillor Ganzeveld, whereas the general manager reports to the full chief and council. So it's a very unique role that I play, and I'm truly blessed and honored to do it. I do apologize. I've taken a lot of time up, but that's the risk and danger that when you asked me to present, because I was a lawyer. So, I mean, lawyers typically can talk for a long period of time, but hopefully what I've shared with you has provided a bit of a different perspective to each of you on the call in terms of what really resulted from the flood and the significant opportunities that are now presenting themselves on a medium to long-term basis. And I speak from the perspective of one heart and one mind and one spirit here in terms of bringing those messages to the table at the municipal and provincial and federal levels. So thank you very much for putting up with me, and I'm prepared to answer any questions if you have any.
Amazing. I think of all of us here on the call, it's a reminder of the journey of what's taken place so long ago, and the amazing amount of work and collaborative work within, our communities and Mid-River, and it really takes a whole team, a family, our teachings, our knowledge keepers, and I feel honored to hear a summary of the amazing teamwork and family work that's taken place for all people within the impacted traditional lands of the Sumas community. So Cook's Jam for that. So questions, I'm sure there's a few. So
Well, thanks, Diane. That's very kind of you. So, but I put my hands up to each and every First Nation in the entire province, but in particular those that were affected. And so it's important work that is being done. But as I said, a small cog in the overall mechanism moving forward. And I'm blessed that I'm able to access the leadership of the current chief and council, but also the elders in the community and the work that I do with Dave Sheppy and the STSA and the Collaborative Stewardship Forum. So thank you.
Do we have some questions?
I just want to thank you, Richard. I have to head off right now, but thank you, Richard. That was very enlightening, and we have a lot in common in terms of what's going on here at Chiam and also with our tribal, our Palolt groupings, and kind of interested in our understanding a little bit more about your intertribal relations between, say, the Sumas and the Camel with the Chilliwack and maybe even, you know, other tribes, and how you guys are relating on these projects. You guys creating MOUs? Are you doing relationship agreements, or like is it a consultative, a collaborative process, or any?
It's and good to hear from you, Ernie. Always a delight when you're on the calls with me. I treasure the relationship that we have, and so thanks for the question. So a couple of things, if I may. Certainly, I'm expecting that LaCamel will sign off with the G4 memorandum that is still under negotiation with being led by the Ministry of Forests. There has been outreach by Chief Silver and Council with respect to our cousins. I like to say the word "our" because I'm part of the community, certainly from an executive perspective, with the tribes south of the border, and eventually they'll be participating in the transboundary discussions. I think it's critically important, and it's a good reminder, Ernie, that we are all stronger if we're paddling in that same canoe. And that's why I treasure the relationships that I have at the STSA and the Collaborative Stewardship Forum and the Chilliwack tribes, because we all have common interests here at the end of the day. And so I think that's always something that First Nations have to do going forward to deal with government, certainly in terms of my experience dealing with government. So because they do listen to stronger voices. And I truly value the different perspectives, though, that each First Nation brings to the table when I sit on the various committees at the STSA on behalf of Sumas Nation. And so I would encourage all of you on the call. And for the business people on the call who are not First Nations, I just think this is an amazing opportunity for you at a micro scale level in terms of individual businesses. But in particular, I've worked for like Chevron as an example. Originally, I'm an oil and gas lawyer, but if you're either a small, medium, or long, a huge business in Canada, but particularly BC, if you're not engaging in joint venture relationships and partnerships with First Nations, you're completely missing the boat. You're doing a disservice to your shareholders. You're doing a disservice to the community at large. And I think that corporations that don't do this are not going to be the smart executives of the future that need to lead those organizations. So that's me, but it's me having worked in the private sector, having worked in the public sector, and now having worked with my third First Nation here, that I've had the privilege to be able to draw all those experiences together and to look at what are the good things and what are the bad things. And if you're not holding hands and walking down the same path together, then I think it's truly not going to work. And it's kind of a given from my perspective, but maybe the light bulb hasn't gone on in particular with some people. And so, you know, if you do want to reach out to me after the fact, I'm more than happy, especially the business people on the call, but everybody on the call. If you want to give me a call, I'm more than happy if you, reach out to me, and I'm more than happy to give a chat and have a chat with you or a cup of coffee. And Ernie, we need to have a lunch at some point in time. So.
Awesome, great question. Is there any other questions for Richard?
Maybe one other, if I could give an explanation, and I guess it's kind of a support, but I think it's about 20 years ago now, maybe a little bit longer, two very, very smart ladies got together and created FAST, F-A-S-T. It's an emergency response company that supplies emergency response equipment throughout Canada now. So they're located on River Road in Delta, and it does that literally. It's FAST. I've personally bought equipment that I carry around in my car. So very similar to the previous presenter, is I carry an emergency kit in my car because each of us should be responsible at least to be able to maintain ourselves for 72 hours. But I think that there's economic opportunities with respect to being able to piggyback off of future emergency responses, or to facilitate, training programs like this. I would certainly echo and encourage the ability that everybody goes out and gets that basic first aid training. and even go beyond that. I know that there is opportunities for First Nations to be able to access funding from EMBC. And I know that Tyrone McNeil at EPS is heavily involved in lobbying for all of the nations across the province to at least get some funding in place to provide, because a lot of First Nations, they do this on the side of their desks. And so if you have, a $50,000 capacity funding every year, at least you have the ability to respond to wildfires, forest fires, whatever the next virus is, whatever the next emergency issue is, because First Nations in particular are bereft of those kind of resources, except for the larger ones in the province that have the ability to bring that expertise to not just their community, but their nation, their neighbors, because everybody's in the same basket in an emergency. And that's why, again, the chief and council said, Richard, don't think of anything else other than health and safety. Then we can get involved in the longer term implications and massaging of what we would appreciate and look for going forward, because our First Nations core values will benefit not just the environment, but the rest of the society as well. So.
Wonderful. Do we have any, just recognizing the time, is there any other questions or thoughts, or everyone, those that know me, when I, every day in the EOC, I would do this 310 days for the out of community members that I looked after. We did a checkout. So I just like to go around the room. Lori, is there anything you have on your mind or would like to share? Thank you.
No, I there's a lot of information, great information about community and just everything. It's quite great. A lot of stuff, like my brain's just blown with a lot of stuff I've heard today, which is wonderful. I thank you very much for the information, and yeah, that's all.
Well, thank you for listening. So.
Gertrude.
Yes, a lot of good information. I'm going to go implement some backpack for our staff vehicles. Thank you.
Welcome.
Pete.
Yeah, actually, Richard, there's been a lot of history in some of what you've talked about. Some of it I knew, some of it I didn't. So thank you for that information. There's a lot going on that I wasn't aware of in terms of intergovernmental relationships and how that all works in the background. So thank you for that. Thank you for putting on this this webinar, Diane, and look forward to seeing more of these. Very interesting information, and the stories that we've heard here today have been really interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Cookstrom, thank you. And Dale.
Very interesting, and thank you so much. I'm an old fart, probably older than any of you, but if you can hear me, my voice is going as my years go on. Anyway, thank you very much, Richard. That was
well, thank you, Dale, for listening. It's a pleasure to have you on the call, and I appreciate the time that you took to listen to the presentation.
well, it's great to know the planning and the collaboration that's going on, and the growth in that field of collaboration. Thank you.
My pleasure. Let's amot.
And then maybe just my fellow staff is, if there's anything you have on your mind, Bridget or Shannon. Any thoughts? And Cheyenne?
I just wanted to say thank you for all the information today. I know for me personally, like a goal of mine eventually is to start my own business, and working here, I know that there's a business plan that needs to be done and stuff before you do that, but I totally forgot, oh yeah, you do need emergency planning, a part of your business plan, just in case something does happen. So I'm glad that I could attend this and learn all of this information. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Bridget.
Awesome. Shannon?
I was going to kind of build on that, because as I've been having discussions with different businesses, it's not always sometimes the business that gets impacted, but their customers.
Yeah.
And it's kind of looking at, as you're developing that, you know, how are your customers and they're impacted. And we've really seen over the last, well, even since COVID, supply lines and things like that, like things that you can't possibly plan for, but knowing how to pivot and how to access those resources and who to contact. So this information has been really amazing, because there was things that I hadn't even considered. And I thought I knew a lot about what had happened, but I really didn't. And so we started hearing stories from our clients and businesses about how they were impacted. Like we had a client that was stuck in Hope. He runs a gym. Okay, well, you know, just get home. It took him a week to get home. But in that meantime, who's running his classes? You know, so his business wasn't flooded, but his business was impacted. So great information. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. And I think what it shows the importance of not just the ability to have your customers online, but perhaps even on an interim basis to be able to provide people who are actually available to provide that service to, like your gym owner, to step in on a short-term basis. So there's some unique opportunities there as well. So I would encourage all the people on the business end of things here to think about that online component, because your customer is not stuck in water. They're not stuck in the forest fire. They might be, but all of your other potential customers are not. And so they physically don't have to get to your place of business. So that's the beauty. I mean, there's the disadvantage that you don't have that one-on-one personal interrelationship, but certainly those are good things to think about.
Thank you. And then Cheyenne, any thoughts or comments? And then we'll turn it over to Rosio to close. Oh, I have a couple slides yet too I wanted to share. So
okay. No, I
Cheyenne.
want to thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for inviting Samath to the team to be present to present today. I think that it is, you know, opportunities like this to share and to listen that we learn the most. And I think that there's always value in these engagement sessions. So thank you for inviting us. And I appreciate just being able to listen in and listen to different aspects as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Sharon.
Awesome. So just before I turn it over to Rosio to finish with the power slide, that PowerPoint, and the work that I'm doing along with my co-workers is just finishing. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Is resources. If we think of, yes, we have many different resources with emergency management and climate readiness there. They've now changed over their name. There is what we have here at S'ólh Community Futures is the support to utilize the current forms that all business owners have access to, and to support you through that process. We also have, again, thanking Lisa Benini, the 15-step process for your business, and ready to start our next sessions and webinars, as we heard here today, is to start to know your risk. How do you do that, and what are those steps? I think we're ready for champion those communities and businesses. As we've heard in community, our 31 mainland Coast Salish communities that we're surrounded by here, from Hope out to Vancouver, the plans and new kind of plans that they're working through, but now you as an individual, but also as an entrepreneur, let's get started. So this is an amazing 15-step process to get your business, those things listed here to get started. And again, today we've talked about 3 years ago, we've only would have talked about a COVID-19 pandemic here within S'ólh Téméxw. As we started in the earlier, the landslides, the atmospheric river, just before Christmas, we all were on calls again, and that is in the news again. Severe weather. We also have to think about already in our food chain, like their medication, pain medication, right? We weren't through this. So the best thing we can do as an individual, as a business owner, entrepreneur, what are the risks? What are the risks where your business is currently? Who is it that you connect with? If you're out of community, who's that emergency leader and what's that process? And if you're in community, who's your emergency program coordinator? Sumas has an amazing lead. Jenna Nopin is been brought on, one of those new emergency program coordinators. LaCamel, we have a brand new person just within the last month, Christina. And then over at Sq'ewá, we have Cindy Collins and a new support person there, all within the last month. So many of our communities that we work with, you have community and family there, are all getting prepared. And so that is one of the things, as an example, a simple risk assessment where you are, where your business is. This is what we'll start to go through on a simple online review of a document that will roll into a simple plan for you, not 148 pages or 300 pages. The 3 events that I participated in, devastating, the worst disaster I see in a First Nations community, the Lytton Creek wildfire, hundreds of, the loss there is just devastating. I remember when I, again, what I share here is my journey. I do not represent Lytton First Nation. July 5th, walking in to say, do you have a plan? And yeah, here's the binder. Has anyone opened up that, right? Nothing. Okay, let's pull together the knowledge keepers. So this is a simple example of how we will support you in doing the plan. So that's by connecting with me to have that individual business meeting to say, oh my gosh, I just want a 2-page plan, immediately, and then, work on a larger plan, a larger one. We will have start now. We've had a couple of sessions. I think we'll have our next webinar will be, and please email either Shannon, Rosia, or myself, or any of us around, this is what I'd like to see in a webinar or workshop. But let's start to take a look at what are those hazards, what was a simple plan, maybe a larger version plan, but also thinking of the business sectors around. Right now we have 29 businesses that can support emergency events. That's our construction, our flagging crew, our caterers. Instead of bringing in the Salvation Army to a local event to feed the first responders, we have S'ólh Catering in Sumas, right? So starting to who can support currently any events, but let's get ready together and utilize our Indigenous entrepreneurs, within S'ólh Téméxw, and that's the next steps that we have. So my goal for our next workshop would be to have those, as we couldn't have Teresa today, but we do have local businesses within S'ólh Téméxw that what they did to take place to look after themselves in the wildfire, in the atmospheric river, the landslides, or power outages. So that will be our next webinar. But I just want to thank all of you here today for the journey and sharing all the knowledge that you have. With that, I'm going to turn it over to close out our session. Any questions for me before I turn it over to Rosia? Okay, everyone knows how to get a hold of me. An amazing day. Take care. Thank you, Rosia.
Yeah, no, thank you, Richard. That was incredible information. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. This is how we learn, right? This is why we're having this webinar, is to share information with each other. Like you're saying, we're talked about collaboration, all of the things that will help each other on how we can be in that canoe together, paddling together, as you mentioned, Richard. So no need to apologize for the time. It's valuable to us. It's appreciated. And we can't thank you enough for that. And, certainly Brian Jones will know a lot about us because he was our board chair for many, many years. So, Chief Dalton, just incredible leadership that's at Samath. And obviously you have been an incredible addition to that amazing team with Cheyenne and everyone that works. Ida, we know so many of the community leaders there. And it's just a pleasure to be connected. And again, thank you to the participants. This is what we're doing here at S'ólh Community Futures, is trying to create these information sessions, these webinars, these workshops, to share this knowledge, to share the tools that will benefit you at the end of the day. And we're just thrilled to have Diane part of our team, to have these opportunities to share. I mean, she comes with an incredible resume herself, incredible experience, and we're just thrilled to have her with us. So thank you again, Richard. Thank you all for participating. We appreciate your time. We know we've gone over, but boy, this was really worth the time and the extra. So thank you, Richard, everyone, Cheyenne, and all of the participants. Thank you for your time. And hopefully we will connect again and cross paths in the future. If anybody again has questions for Diane, for any of us on our team, Shannon, Bridget, and myself, please feel free to reach out, and hopefully we'll cross paths out at Samath sometime soon, Richard and Cheyenne as well.
Thank you. And again, it was my pleasure to meet every one of you virtually. And please don't be shy. If you have individual questions, Diane, you have all my contact information. So, you can give my cell phone number out or my email address, whatever you're comfortable with. I'm happy to help, because part of my role is to educate and provide the knowledge that I'm blessed to carry on behalf of the nation, but also in terms of my career as a lawyer and an executive. So I would encourage you, if you do have questions, I'm very happy to take those calls. So, and acknowledgement to Cheyenne, because the reason I'm able to be successful is Cheyenne's my boss as far as I'm concerned. So she's amazing. So
way to go, Cheyenne.
So thanks, everybody.
Thank you
Have a
all
great
again.
rest of
Thank
the
you,
day
Richard.
and a wonderful weekend. All right. Take care.
Thank you all. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Are you able to stop the recording now? Thank you. Thank you, Bridget.